Hey internets. Some of you may be aware of a very common disease that is somewhat of a subset of Trump derangement syndrome. And this of course is Elon Musk derangement syndrome, where people who dislike Elon Musk allow it to reach a point of manic obsession. And as a result, of course, they interpret anything and everything that Elon Musk does in the most absolutely ridiculous, bad faith, disconnected from reality manner that they possibly can. Which is unfortunate because it leads to a lot of very stupid, bad political takes, often from people in positions of high influence such as the mainstream media or people who are actually politicians, which then of course leads to a massive amount of disinformation spreading around, because of course the people suffering from these derangement syndromes can't tell the difference between what is true and what is simply the product of their bad faith delusions. Also, this is another self-sponsored video. I've got some new Doge-related merch up on the good old merch store, and I figured I'd do another introductory sale because why not? Plus, I'm going to be doing some more Doge-related content in the future. But as for the merch itself, I included a texted and textless version of it, and in both cases you can select the colors. And of course, a dank mug version for good measure. Personally designed these myself, and the profits really do help out the channel. And plus, just look at how smug that Doge is. You know you want it. So links to buy these things will be in the description below. Anyways, back to the EDS question. And I bring this up because there has been a relatively recent case of Elon Musk derangement syndrome going around the interwebs that perfectly emphasizes a problem I've seen in the last 2 decades. And the event in question that showcases this is the recent phenomenon of these absolute blithering midwits taking the side of South Africa's absolutely insane collective ethno-guilt laws. The conversation's been going on for a while, but it recently reached a boiling point with this ex-post right here from Musk. Starlink is not allowed to operate in South Africa because I'm not black. Yep, that's pretty much what it is. He isn't joking, that's effectively what the laws there actually do. And here's a bit of history, but condensed because it's not the main point of this video. Basically, apartheid happened in South Africa, which were laws that legally separated people based on ethnicity. These laws were ended over 30 years ago, and what has South Africa put in its place? Well, they unfortunately fell for the good old-fashioned fallacy of thinking you could fix alleged crimes of the past with collective guilt today, despite the fact that many of the people alive today had nothing to do with apartheid in the past. It's summarized relatively nicely in this post right here. There are 142 race-based laws in operation in South Africa. During apartheid, these types of laws discriminated against not white people. Since 1994, they have been reversed to discriminate against non-black people. And yes, unfortunately, the justification for this is exactly as stupid as you may imagine. The state did a bad thing to Group X, and therefore, for the sake of fairness, the state is now justified in doing the same thing to Group Y. Now, what they're specifically referring to here is the Black Economic Empowerment Laws. These are policies of the South African government that give preferential treatment to businesses, that give ownership and positions to people based on their ethnicity. And the reason it's more accurate to say ethnicity rather than just black is because they've actually kind of gone back and forth in the history of what they consider black. For example, they often switch back and forth on whether or not they consider Chinese to be considered black for the case of these South African laws. So in other words, the only real consistency here is not white. So it's really, in practice, just state-enforced discrimination against you for being white in South Africa. And the way the law works in practice is it just gives businesses a scorecard based on a percentage of how many people who are not white own the business, how many people who are not white are managers of the business, and based on the number of collectivist ethno-guilt points the business has, they may or may not be allowed to do business in South Africa, because certain telecommunications and mining licenses and building permits and whatnot will only be granted to a business that either has enough points or has a certain percentage of being black owned, which again they tend to define as just not being white. Now, how this is relevant to Elon Musk and Starlink, of course, in order to be eligible to apply for a permit for Starlink to operate in South Africa, he would have to give 30% of the company away to people that the South African government defines as black, aka most of the time just meaning not white, aka not Elon Musk. Now, why these South African laws are ridiculous is honestly kind of obvious. It is again just collective ethno-guilt. All of these laws can be summarized as white people bad. But that's not what's really interesting here. Anybody can farm this happening for obvious content. What I find more interesting here is how it emphasizes a problem I've noticed for a while. And to understand this problem, let's look at what a few pseudo-intellectuals have been saying in regards to Elon Musk's little Starlink happening here. For instance, this random individual who is very highly unlikely to be above +1 SD on the G-Bell curve, McSpocky, who thinks that he's an absolute genius for saying, oh no, it's just because he hasn't applied for a license. Which, like all midwit takes, is of course pedantically correct. Regardless of whether or not he's applied for a license, has nothing to do within the context of the conversation of whether or not these South African laws are just. This is a common problem with suits. They think that if they nitpick at something that doesn't really matter, then this somehow counts as refuting the main point, even though it has absolutely nothing to do with the main central point. It completely ignores what the actual conversation is about, which is that these BEE laws are stupid and shouldn't exist. Because again, it is just collective guilt, enshrined into law. And of course, the sad thing about these derangement syndromes is that they cause people to resort to extremely stupid arguments. Arguments that are just so obviously fallacious that even a 6-year-old child can understand what's wrong with them. Like this guy, for example, saying, Elon, stop the victim complex. Starlink isn't banned in South Africa because of your skin color. It's because you refuse to comply with local laws like every other telecom provider. Play by the rules or stay out. Simple. Except that, of course, the rule in question here from South Africa is a law that requires 30% ownership of not being white. Now, Elon Musk owns 42% of Starlink. So obviously, if Elon Musk was black, he wouldn't have to worry about this regulation. Again, I'm pretty sure you can explain this to a child. I know for a fact my 6-year-old self would not have any troubles understanding that a rule that requires a portion of your business to be owned by someone with a certain skin color would obviously not be an issue if you had that skin color to begin with. And so their derangement levels are so off the charts that they find themselves willing to accept these just absolutely insane tier arguments that no reasonable or serious person under any other context would accept. And they're not random trolls either. Like this one guy has over 100,000 followers. These are unfortunately actual adults. And they're of course using all the standard low IQ arguments in the book. Like this guy, he refuses to abide by the telecommunication laws of South Africa. You know, the standard circular argument, it's the law, therefore it is good, and it is good, therefore it should be the law. Round and round that logic goes forever. You know, the kind of stupid arguments that people make when they don't want to admit the real reason for why they believe a certain thing. Which of course is that they have Elon Musk derangement syndrome, along with most likely a dash of anti-white racism. Such as one clip I noticed from the Karen Hunter show that came with the standard collectivist argument in justification for this, that blacks somehow collectively own all of Africa. You know, the kind of arguments that they wouldn't accept in reverse. If someone were to say that white people collectively own Europe, these same people would freak out and call that white nationalism. Because of course, they don't actually believe the arguments that are coming out of their own mouths. It's all just a bunch of post hoc justifications for their hatred and envy. And I must unfortunately inform you that many mainstream journalists, of course, double down on this stupidity. Like this little Pop-Tart from the Context News, Musk Starlink stalls in South Africa over equity laws. Just read this little tidbit right here. To comply with BBBEE, at least 30% of SpaceX's South African operations would have to be sold or donated to stakeholders from historically disadvantaged groups. And then, in the very next little tidbit, because it is an international company, not because of Elon Musk's race. Imagine actually writing this. Within the same sentence, just completely contradicting your own reasoning. Again, it's not exactly a difficult step in logic. We're not talking 5 moves in a dialectic here before you figure out the truth of the matter. This is one move. This is not complicated. He owns 42% of the company, and therefore he would be in compliance with a law that requires 30% ownership based on ethnicity if he was that ethnicity. This is, again, something that a child could understand. And the truth, sadly, of course, is she probably does understand this. This person is probably just another lying journalist propaganda shill. Typical journo behavior at this point. Because, of course, there's more than one journo who did this. So, for example, we have here Because I'm Not Black from the Mary Sue, Elon Musk's infuriating lies, as well as this little journoid from IOL, Elon Musk lies again. Starlink not allowed to operate in Africa because I'm not black. Both of them pretty much just doubling down on the absolute insane backwards reasoning, where they interpret what Musk is saying literally, and yet completely out of context with what the laws of South Africa actually are. I mean, sure, if you want to get technical and pedantic about it, Starlink could technically still operate there if they sold 30% equity or something, or invested in some other equivalent, just enough that they would earn enough points within the black economic empowerment regulations that they could then be allowed to operate, and the fact that Elon Musk is not black wouldn't then matter. But that, of course, ignores the context of those laws and completely ignores the question of whether or not those laws are just, which again, just basic analysis of the policies reveals that they're not just at all. It's just completely ignoring the reality that if Elon Musk was black, he would already be in line with those regulations. He would already have enough points within the black economic empowerment system that the South African government uses as their regulation to enforce their ethno-guilt ideology. And so any journalist who ignores that context is lying to you. And in my opinion, anybody who resorts to this kind of rhetoric just comes across as a deeply unserious person. But again, that's kind of how derangement syndrome operates. Whether it's Trump or Elon Musk derangement syndrome, because they've allowed their seething and coping to reach a point where their mental logic flow no longer self-aborts when it reaches an obvious contradiction. And so in their minds, reality matters less than the fact that Spaceship Man is bad, and that they must therefore inform the public on how bad Spaceship Man is, even when he's very obviously in the right. And to the mainstream media's credit, some of them did in fact report it somewhat honestly. For example, the Business Insider did a much better job. Not a great job, because they still remained kind of neutral on an issue that isn't really something you should remain neutral on. You can't really take a neutral position on obvious things like someone claiming 1 + 1 = 3. There are cases where some people are just objectively in the right, and this is one of them, but at least Business Insider immediately admitted that it had to do with the Black Economic Empowerment regulations, and that the happening that Elon Musk has stirred up here is largely about a debate over the South African government's policies, and the business practices that they try to force with the BEE's, again, what I like to call ethno-guilt regulations. Because again, that's all these really are. South African racial laws today are just based on the flawed idea of punishing people based on their ethnicity today from these alleged crimes that happened 1 to 2 generations ago. And of course it doesn't work. I mean, aside from just ethics and philosophy and it being wrong because you can't really impugn collective guilt on individuals, it doesn't actually make any sense. It is, even in an absolute best case scenario, a very lazy and unintelligent way to do justice. If you just study basic history, we have plenty of documented evidence that shows that collective punishment doesn't work. And it never will work because it is based on a flawed misunderstanding of how individual rights actually function. And so Elon Musk is absolutely in the right to call the South African government out on their shenanigans here. It is ethno-guilt, it is wokeness on steroids, it is 100% stupid. But sadder than that is again the reaction to it, which brings me to focus on the real main point of this video, which is just seeing how many trash libs are taking the side of the BEE policies really showcases and emphasizes a problem I've noticed for a long time, which is that the reasonable far left is dead. They don't exist anymore. And oh yes, they really did used to exist. Those of us old enough to remember, which you honestly don't have to be that old, can remember that even as early as the late 1990s, a lot of people in the far left had a much more reasonable justification for their stances on economic inequality, which is that it was more about helping people who are down on their luck. I remember a long time ago, a lot more people on the far left were more likely to argue things like, well, many of the rich are simply lucky, rather than working hard. That we live in a society with lots of rules and lots of different things happening, and of course we have a very large infrastructure that has been built over hundreds of years. And just about everybody who gets rich today depends at least somewhat on the ingenuity and the infrastructure created before they were born. It's just the reality of how human society works and how scientific advancement happens. And so that's a much better justification to look at things from the standpoint of economic inequality, because it actually has some truth to it. A lot of times wealth is just luck. Now, of course, on average, if you look at people who are wealthy and people who are not wealthy, the wealthier do usually have higher intelligence and better work ethic, and we're more likely to attend higher education, etc., etc. However, there are billions of us on this planet, and the reality is there are things that are outside of our control. We all roll the dice with every action that we take, and some of us statistically are going to consistently roll snake eyes. And so you are statistically going to have a very small number of people who are brilliant, hard workers, and yet end up with nothing every single time. And then there are very lazy, stupid people who are just kind of born into a wealthy family and inherit it all. And because of this, back in the day, lefties were a lot more likely to make arguments and justifications along the lines of, oh, well, we live in a society where some people are fortunate and some people are not, and so a moral and just society needs to have some form of charity and some form of respect for the poor. So there was this very big justification that being rich was more based on luck. And that's a justification that is, again, one that is grounded in some level of truth. Not all the time, but statistically it does happen. It is absolutely possible for a person to get screwed over as a result of things outside of their control. And those of us who support the free market, those of us with a libertarian-minded view of society, need to acknowledge that. It's one of the reasons why one of my older videos was about mutual aid societies. I do believe that in a free world, just about everybody should voluntarily associate themselves with an aid network of their choice. Charity towards the less fortunate is in fact a virtue that society needs to thrive. There is very good evidence that shows that that is a low time preference virtue. A culture where people don't care about the well-being of others in the society is a society that doesn't last. That's just kind of a reality. And plus, this justification is actually compatible with libertarian philosophy. There's absolutely no contradiction whatsoever between libertarian thinking and charity, and recognizing that some poor people are in fact just unlucky. But of course, the problem is, and the issue that this latest happening has once again revealed, is that that kind of leftist thinking is very increasingly rare. They've dumped the less fortunate narrative in favor of the oppression narrative. So no longer do you really see much of the far left using an appeal to virtuous senses of voluntary charity. Oh, no, no, no. Now it's all all about this cringe, mandatory, state-enforced altruism. And the less fortunate/more fortunate argument just doesn't really do it for them. So instead, now the rich, rather than just some of them being lucky, the narrative now is that they are all beneficiaries of some corrupt white supremacist system, and that they have gained their riches through oppression and systemic discrimination of disadvantaged groups. Trademark. So now the narrative is, rather than the rich being lucky, they are now the villains. They're now the bad guys. Trademark. This resurrection of this belief that the economy is always a zero-sum game. The rich do not have more because they've generated more, but rather the rich have more through exploitation and stealing surplus labor value from the poor. And that's what people taking the side of the South African government in this particular context of Elon Musk really highlights. It's just a sad and unfortunate reminder to us of the fact that the Marxist takeover of all leftist thinking has effectively been completed. And so the reasonable left is dead, long live collectivist brain rot. And it's really kind of sad. I don't even remember the last time I saw someone who would consider themselves a far lefty using the luck justification for an appeal to voluntary charity. In fact, I distinctly recall exactly the opposite. Now you're more likely to see them just openly being socialist and actually getting upset when they see charity. So instead of viewing philanthropy as a good thing, they instead look at it as bad because it justifies the continuation of the capitalist exploitation system. And so true libertarian leftism is just not a thing anymore. And in place what we see is something that is just entirely statist. They now all want to lick the boot of a government that views any and all success as the result of some kind of oppression. And under this mindset, anybody who's rich hasn't actually done anything right. They haven't actually produced anything, but rather instead they're just the beneficiary of privilege and colonialism and whatnot. And so any and all sense of virtue in the ideology has now been replaced with victimhood. You'll no longer see things like you should give to your less fortunate brother because we've all had our downtimes in life. Now instead it's just an authoritarian justification that the rich have collectively done something evil to the poor and that's why they're rich. The fact that this new justification, the collectivist brain rot justification, isn't true doesn't really seem to matter to them. It obviously doesn't hold up to any basic scrutiny. I mean, I've already pointed out many times in both the equity fallacy and the equality fallacy. The oppression narrative is objectively, demonstrably false. But things like this, where them calling Elon Musk a liar when he's very much telling the truth, I think that really sadly shows that they don't really care about the truth anymore. Which I guess there's kind of a silver lining in that, because this case of Elon Musk derangement syndrome has shown that a lot of them are now just openly admitting and telling us that they have completely lost connection with reason. So we can at least just kind of know that we have in fact reached the point where the best thing we can do is just make sure none of these psychos ever gain power. We can look at the South African government's absolutely insane pants-on-head ethno-guilt policies and know for a fact that, yep, the lefties sadly really do want to do the same thing in Western countries. They want those policies in America, they want those policies in various European countries, they want these big government solutions everywhere. The establishment in the government is corrupt, and the solution is more establishment and more government. And collective guilt has caused problems in the past, and the solution is to do more collective guilt today. Yep, that'll totally fix everything. And the saddest thing of all, or the funniest, depending on which way you look at it, is just the fact that this just isn't really that surprising. I mean, really, does seeing socialists and partisan hacks simping for the South African government's ethno-guilt policies really a shocker to anybody at this point? Because looking at a lot of the rhetoric from journalists and various decadent elites in the last few decades, it's really what we just expect at this point. For instance, there's the saying amongst the old Buggians that Cthulhu may swim slowly, but he only swims left. And I think that's actually just an oversimplification of a much more broader concept. I think it's more like Cthulhu, or chaos, just kind of swims in the direction of a society or ideology's logical conclusion. And so if there's some kind of flaw in the way society thinks, or a flaw in the ideology that the society is following, then as time goes on, that flaw becomes harder and harder to ignore. People start drawing attention to the flaw, because the flaw never really goes away, because the society doesn't actually have a way of dealing with the flaw. And so in order to fix it without admitting that their ideology is wrong, or without admitting that something in society is wrong, or without admitting that something in their core philosophy is wrong, people are forced to resort to crazier and crazier acts and more ridiculous mental gymnastics in order to justify their belief without actually acknowledging that the flaw is their fault. And that's what we're really seeing here. I think the moment that the radical left shifted to the point where the vast majority of them now accept the oppression narrative that inequalities are generally caused by an oppressor-victim dichotomy, it was just kind of inevitable. Because the more reasonable justification that we used to see in genuine libertarian leftist thinking, the justification that you should care for your brethren because sometimes he's just down on his luck, that sometimes rich and poor or is just a matter of luck. Or to just put it really simply, life isn't fair. That narrative just doesn't have the same strong spike to it, even though it has more truth to it. I think they've kind of dropped that narrative because it doesn't let them justify using the state to do it. So while the oppression narrative may not be true, it does justify an authoritarian power grab if you pretend that it is true. And this allows them to compartmentalize away the fact that they've really just unfortunately become useful idiots for the establishment that they claim to be fighting against. Which of course is completely insane, and so being disingenuous and being openly dishonest is really the only game left. Nobody wants to just outright admit that they no longer believe in any principles and they're just flapping words out of their mouths in order to justify gaining power. So instead we see this open deception. For instance, going back to that IOL article, it makes no attempt whatsoever to hide the fact that it's lying from anybody who's actually informed on this specific event. For instance, it reads, in a recent post, Musk claimed that his satellite internet constellation, Starlink, is not allowed in South Africa because he is not black. Tesla owner was responding to another misinformation claim that there are 140 race-based laws in the country which are all anti-white. In actuality, Musk's Starlink plans to expand into South Africa have been halted as the business withdrew from regulatory hearings held by the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa. Which, of course, when you know that the regulations and questions are about BEE's policy of requiring a certain percentage of ethnic representation in the ownership, when you know that those regulations that Starlink has a problem with are regulations that specifically target Elon Musk because he is white, you just immediately know that this journalist is lying. It's not even really a half-truth spin job here, it's just an outright blatant falsification. And in some ways that's kind of funny, but in the same ways it's also kind of sad. It's sad that we have reached this point in society where everyone's just kind of playing the Game of Thrones. We've reached this kind of post-truth point in society where people are just saying whatever they think they need to say in order to justify whatever they think they need to justify in order for them to quote-unquote win. And this really emphasizes the need for those of us who care about freedom still to put a more greater focus on delegitimizing the psychopaths. Because one white pill is that the average person doesn't actually like this crap. Even here where I live, around the Portland, Oregon area, when you explain equity crap to your average normal person, they generally reject the oppression narrative. Most people find this to be absurd and weird because it is. The problem is people don't realize just how many people in elite positions and in journalist positions are using this kind of reasoning to lie to them. They don't realize just how much of what we see in establishment media is just deranged authoritarian propaganda. The normies are just still, unfortunately, completely unaware of just how much of what they see is fake. And I think this is one of the reasons why a lot of general conservatives are okay with Hoppian libertarians like myself, but dislike general libertarians who reject Hop. There are some deep cultural issues behind all of these problems that really do need to be addressed. I've seen a few libertarians out there occasionally getting upset at people like me for calling out anti-white racism. And the thing is, you have to realize that this is the manner by which the authoritarian leftists are currently drawing their justifications for more power from. They are using ethno-guilt to justify Marxism. And I think any political strategy for libertarians going forward that refuses to acknowledge that fact is equivalent to just sticking your head in the sand. Sorry if that sounds a bit harsh, but that's just how it is. I think a lot of centrist liberals can still be reasoned with here, especially the ones that reject the equity fallacy. But for the ones that do accept the equity fallacy, unfortunately, I don't think libertarians can really reason with the far lefties anymore, at the very least on this specific topic. We are, in fact, very much long past that point. And so what we should really be doing instead is focusing on showing the general public that this is the crap that awaits them if they keep giving in to the left. Normies need to understand that if they look at South Africa and they don't like what they're seeing, then they need to stop voting for any whack job who promises equity, because we are well past the point where it's always a grift. Anyways, that is all. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe, and if you like my content, you can support me on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or by buying some merch, or by becoming a member of the channel. And again, there is some new merch on the merch store. Some Doge-related merch, since again, this is an Elon Musk-related video. And I'm going to be doing another video relatively soon, as in probably this month, focused on debunking a lot of the misinformation surrounding Doge, or the Department of Government Efficiency, because a lot of the way that journos have been covering Doge is just as high on the gaslighting scale as what I've just covered in this video. But for now, that is all, so till next time.